Please wait outside. This meeting is for decision makers. The sentence landed like a door closing in front of everyone in the room. A few managers exchanged amused glances. One of them looked down at the resume in front of him and smirked. Jasmine Brooks remained seated. She did not argue. She did not react. She simply folded her hands neatly on the conference table and looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Morning sunlight poured across the polished wood surface, reflecting off crystal water glasses and silver laptops. The hiring meeting had started only 15 minutes earlier, yet Rebecca Collins had already decided exactly who Jasmine was, or at least who she believed Jasmine was. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. As Human Resources Director, she had built a reputation for making fast judgments. She considered it a gift. Others called it instinct. In reality, very few people ever challenged her. "I am just trying to save everyone time," Rebecca said. "Some positions require a certain level of experience and presence." The word presence hung in the air. Several executives nodded quietly. Jasmine understood what Rebecca really meant. She had heard versions of it her entire life. Different words. Same message. "You do not belong here." Jasmine glanced down at her resume. Years of education. Years of leadership experience. Years spent helping organizations improve accountability and fairness. Yet none of that seemed to matter. Rebecca had looked at her for less than 30 seconds before making up her mind. The room felt colder than it should have. Air conditioning drifted softly from vents above. Somewhere outside the glass walls, an elevator bell chimed. Jasmine took a slow breath and remained calm. That calmness seemed to irritate Rebecca even more. "You know," Rebecca continued, "successful people understand how to present themselves properly." A few people smiled awkwardly. One manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another pretended to check email. Nobody defended Jasmine. Nobody challenged the comment. The silence said enough. Jasmine looked around the room. Expensive watches, tailored suits, executive titles displayed beside names on digital meeting tablets. Everything about the environment projected authority. Yet she noticed something else. Fear. Not obvious fear. The quieter kind. The kind that kept people from speaking when they knew something was wrong. Rebecca slid a folder across the table. "Perhaps we should move on to the next candidate." Her tone made it clear the discussion was finished. Jasmine slowly gathered her papers. Not because she agreed. Not because she accepted the judgment. Simply because she refused to let someone else's assumptions define her dignity. Sunlight shifted across the conference table as clouds passed outside. For a brief moment, the room darkened. Jasmine stood and adjusted her navy blazer. Her expression remained composed, graceful, almost surprisingly peaceful. Rebecca looked satisfied. The meeting had gone exactly the way she expected. Then Jasmine noticed something on the presentation screen behind them. A chart showing recruitment data from the previous year. Her eyes narrowed slightly. One statistic immediately stood out. It was not just inaccurate. It revealed a deeper problem hidden inside the company's hiring process. Jasmine hesitated. She could walk away. She could leave quietly and never think about this room again. Instead, she turned back toward the screen. "Before I go," she said softly, "there is something important you may want to look at." The room fell silent. Rebecca's smile disappeared. And for the first time that morning, every person at the table looked directly at Jasmine Brooks. Jasmine's words seemed to freeze the room. The executives who had been ready to move on now glanced toward the presentation screen. Rebecca Collins narrowed her eyes. "What exactly are you talking about?" she asked. Jasmine stepped closer to the display. The giant screen illuminated the conference room with pale blue light, reflecting across polished glass and chrome surfaces. Beyond the windows, downtown Chicago stretched beneath a bright spring sky. "This chart," Jasmine said calmly, "the company believes it is measuring hiring efficiency." Several managers exchanged puzzled looks. Rebecca crossed her arms. "Because it is." Jasmine shook her head slightly. "No, it is measuring something very different. The room grew quiet again. She pointed to a section of the data. These numbers show that qualified candidates are being eliminated before reaching final review. Not because of performance. Not because of experience. Because of filtering patterns. One executive leaned forward. Another adjusted his glasses. Rebecca gave a short laugh. You have reviewed a single chart for less than a minute. That is all it takes when the pattern is obvious, Jasmine replied. The confidence in her voice caught everyone off guard. She was not defensive. She was not trying to impress anyone. She simply sounded certain. Jasmine advanced to another section of the report. Look here. The rejection rate changes dramatically depending on which reviewer handles the application. A few people around the table began studying the screen more carefully. Rebecca's expression hardened. This information is confidential. Which is exactly why it should concern you, Jasmine said. The room fell silent. Sunlight shifted across the floor as clouds drifted outside. The atmosphere no longer felt like an interview. Felt like something else entirely. One senior manager slowly nodded. She may have a point. Rebecca immediately turned toward him. Based on what? Based on the data. Jasmine continued speaking before the tension could escalate. The problem is not one person. The problem is the system. Qualified people are disappearing from consideration long before leadership ever sees them. Her words lingered in the air. Several executives looked uncomfortable. Some glanced toward Rebecca. Others focused on the reports in front of them. For the first time all morning, uncertainty had entered the room. Jasmine noticed it immediately. She also noticed something else. Fear. Not fear of her. Fear of what the numbers might reveal if someone actually investigated them. Rebecca pushed her chair back slightly. Thank you for your opinion, she said coldly. But this meeting is finished. Jasmine nodded respectfully. Of course. She gathered her papers once again. Yet this time the room watched her differently. The dismissive smiles had vanished. The laughter was gone. Questions had replaced certainty. As Jasmine slipped her resume into a leather folder, her phone vibrated softly inside her purse. She almost ignored it. Then it vibrated again. The screen lit up briefly. A single message appeared. For simple words. I am downstairs now. Jasmine stared at the message for half a second before locking the screen. Nobody noticed except Rebecca. The human resources director frowned. Something about Jasmine's calmness suddenly felt unusual, almost deliberate. Jasmine placed the phone back into her purse and walked toward the conference room door. The polished floor reflected each step. The room remained silent behind her. Just before reaching the exit, she paused and looked back at the screen one final time. If the company ever decides it wants the truth, she said quietly, it should start by asking why talented people never make it into this room. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Behind her, nobody spoke. And somewhere far below in the lobby of the skyscraper, a black luxury sedan had just arrived at the front entrance. The conference room door closed softly behind Jasmine, muting the tension she had left behind. The hallway felt strangely quiet compared to the atmosphere inside. Sunlight streamed through towering glass walls, painting long reflections across polished marble floors. Employees moved between offices carrying tablets, coffee cups, and folders, unaware that a small conversation inside a hiring meeting had just planted the seed of something much larger. Jasmine walked slowly toward the elevator bank, her leather folder resting against her side. Her expression remained calm, but her thoughts were moving quickly. She had not planned to say anything. She had promised herself she would simply observe, listen, and leave. Yet the hiring data on that screen had revealed exactly what she feared. Talent was being filtered through assumptions before it ever reached decision-makers. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. She stepped inside alone. The chrome doors closed, reflecting her image back at her. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the disappointment she had hidden all morning. Not because Rebecca had mocked her. That part was familiar. What troubled her was how many people had remained silent. The elevator descended floor by floor. 32, 31, 30. Each number glowed and disappeared. Jasmine thought about the countless applicants who had probably walked through the same building carrying hope, only to leave wondering why they had never received a fair chance. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, her disappointment had transformed into determination. The doors opened. The vast lobby stretched before her like a cathedral of glass and steel. Sunlight poured through the 60-foot windows facing the city streets. Receptionists answered calls behind polished desks. Visitors crossed the marble floor. Security officers stood near the entrance. Everything appeared normal. Yet Jasmine immediately noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. Several executives were moving through the lobby much faster than usual. Phones were pressed against ears. Assistants hurried toward elevators carrying stacks of documents. Something important was happening. Jasmine stepped outside into the plaza. A cool breeze moved between the skyscrapers. Traffic flowed through downtown Chicago. Horns sounded in the distance. The city felt alive. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a call. A small smile appeared when she saw the name. Daniel Harrison. She answered immediately. "You are here," she said. "I just arrived," Daniel replied. His voice carried the calm confidence that had made him one of the most respected executives in the country. "How did everything go?" Jasmine looked back through the glass walls toward the executive floors high above. "About how you expected." A brief silence followed. Daniel knew exactly what that answer meant. "Did they listen?" he asked. Jasmine watched clouds drifting above the skyline. "Some did." Daniel sighed softly. "And Rebecca?" Jasmine smiled faintly. She was very certain of herself. The response made him laugh quietly. "That sounds like Rebecca." A black luxury sedan pulled away from the curb behind her. Sunlight reflected across its windows before disappearing into traffic. Daniel's tone became more serious. "The board meeting has been moved up." Jasmine frowned slightly. "That was not supposed to happen until next week." "I know," Daniel replied. "Something was discovered in the hiring review this morning." Jasmine immediately thought about the data chart. "How serious?" she asked. "Serious enough that every board member is already on the way upstairs." Jasmine looked toward the towering headquarters. The glass exterior shimmered beneath the midday sun. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Daniel paused for a moment. Then he gave an answer that changed everything. "Come back upstairs. There is something the board needs to hear. And this time, everyone is going to listen." Jasmine ended the call and stood motionless for a moment beneath the towering glass headquarters. The wind moved gently through the plaza, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and city life. Around her, employees hurried in and out of the building without realizing that the day was quietly shifting beneath their feet. She looked up toward the executive floors high above the street. Sunlight flashed across the reflective windows like moving waves of gold. Somewhere inside, board members were gathering. Decisions were being made. Questions were being asked. And for the first time, the people asking those questions were beginning to notice the same problems she had seen within minutes. Jasmine walked back through the revolving doors and entered the lobby. The atmosphere had changed even more since she left. Assistants moved quickly between elevators. Senior managers spoke in hushed tones. Security personnel watched the entrances with unusual attention. The entire building seemed to sense that something important was unfolding. As Jasmine crossed the marble floor, several employees glanced toward her before looking away again. To them, she was simply another visitor, another candidate, another face passing through the building. None of them knew that she was heading toward the most important meeting of the day. The private elevator doors opened before she reached them. A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward. "Miss Brooks?" he asked politely. Jasmine nodded. "The board is waiting upstairs." She followed him into the elevator. The doors closed. Silence filled the space as the elevator climbed rapidly toward the executive levels. Floor numbers illuminated one after another. 35, 36, 37. The city slowly disappeared beneath them. Jasmine studied her reflection in the polished metal walls. She looked exactly the same as she had earlier that morning. the same navy blazer, the same leather folder, the same calm expression, yet everything felt different now. Not because of power, not because of status, because the truth was finally beginning to matter. When the elevator reached the executive floor, the doors opened onto a corridor lined with glass walls and modern artwork. Soft afternoon light filled the space. At the far end of the hallway stood a pair of large walnut doors leading into the boardroom. Several directors were already arriving. Some carried financial reports. Others carried tablets and folders filled with notes. Their conversations were brief and serious. Jasmine noticed concern on many faces. Nobody appeared relaxed. The man accompanying her stopped beside the boardroom entrance. "They are ready," he said. Jasmine thanked him and looked through the narrow glass panel beside the door. Inside, a long conference table stretched across the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Chicago skyline beneath a bright blue sky. At the head of the table sat empty chairs reserved for leadership. Screens displayed charts, reports, and compliance reviews. The room carried the quiet tension of people preparing for difficult conversations. Then Jasmine noticed Rebecca Collins. The human resources director was already inside. She appeared confident as she reviewed documents near her seat. Every movement suggested certainty. Every expression suggested control. Apparently, she still believed the morning had ended in her favor. Jasmine felt no anger toward her, no desire for revenge, only curiosity. Soon Rebecca would be forced to confront information she could no longer dismiss. The boardroom doors opened. Conversations softened. Several directors took their seats. Jasmine stepped inside. For a brief second, Rebecca looked up and saw her. Confusion crossed her face immediately. The room fell noticeably quieter. Nobody understood why the former applicant had entered a board meeting. Nobody except one person. And just as Jasmine took her seat near the center of the table, another door opened behind the executive chairs. Daniel Harrison had arrived. The boardroom seemed to tighten the moment Daniel Harrison entered. Conversations stopped immediately. Chairs shifted softly against the floor. Several directors straightened in their seats. Sunlight poured through the massive windows behind him, creating a halo of light around the executive floor as he walked toward the head of the table. Daniel acknowledged the room with a calm nod before setting a folder on the polished surface in front of him. His expression revealed nothing, yet everyone could feel the weight of the meeting settling into place. Jasmine remained seated quietly near the center of the table. She noticed the confusion spreading through the room. Some directors glanced between her and Daniel. Others looked toward Rebecca Collins, searching for an explanation. Rebecca herself appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Her eyes moved from Jasmine to Daniel and back again. The morning confidence she had displayed during the hiring meeting was beginning to crack. Daniel opened the meeting without delay. "Thank you all for coming on short notice." His voice carried easily through the room. Several concerns were discovered during the latest hiring process review. A large screen illuminated behind him. Charts appeared. Statistics, internal reports, recruitment data covering the previous 18 months. The atmosphere shifted immediately from curiosity to concern. Daniel advanced to the next slide. "These numbers indicate a pattern that cannot be ignored." Several directors leaned forward. Jasmine recognized the same chart she had noticed earlier. Only now it was accompanied by far more information. The pattern was impossible to miss. Highly qualified applicants were disappearing from consideration at significantly higher rates than expected. Entire categories of candidates were being filtered out long before reaching final interviews. One board member frowned. How did this happen? Another director shook his head while studying the figures. These numbers should have triggered an investigation months ago. Rebecca cleared her throat. With respect, statistics can be interpreted many different ways. Daniel looked toward her. That is true. Then he clicked to another slide. This one showed reviewer-specific outcomes. Silence spread across the room. The disparities became even more obvious. Different reviewers produced dramatically different hiring results despite evaluating candidates with similar qualifications. The room grew quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Rebecca shifted in her chair. There may be legitimate explanations. Daniel nodded. There may be. He turned toward Jasmine. Which is why I asked someone with extensive experience in organizational accountability to review the data. Several directors followed his gaze. Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. Her? The single word escaped before she could stop it. Nobody responded immediately. Daniel simply gestured toward the screen. Miss Brooks identified concerns within minutes. The statement landed heavily. Directors exchanged looks. One executive removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another flipped through printed reports searching for answers. Rebecca stared at Jasmine in disbelief. The woman she had dismissed as unqualified had recognized a systemic issue faster than an entire leadership team. Jasmine remained composed. She felt every eye in the room, yet she refused to let the moment become personal. This was never about proving Rebecca wrong. It was about revealing what the data was trying to say. Daniel stepped away from the screen and rested both hands on the conference table. The question before us is not whether there is a problem. His voice remained steady. The question is whether we are willing to confront it honestly. Nobody spoke. Sunlight shifted across the room as a cloud drifted past the skyline. The silence felt different now. Heavier. More uncertain. Then Rebecca finally leaned forward and asked the question everyone had been wondering. Why exactly does her opinion carry so much weight with you? The room froze, and for the first time all afternoon, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. The smile was small, almost invisible, yet it immediately changed the atmosphere inside the boardroom. Daniel Harrison looked around the table before answering Rebecca's question. No one spoke. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls as afternoon sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. Every director seemed to sense that something important was about to be revealed. Daniel folded his hands calmly on the conference table. Because expertise matters, he said. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. There are many experts. Daniel nodded. That is true. His gaze briefly shifted toward Jasmine before returning to the room. But there are very few people I trust to tell me the truth when it would be easier to stay silent. The room remained quiet. Several directors glanced toward Jasmine again. The perception of her had already begun to change. Earlier that morning she had been viewed as a candidate seeking approval. Now she sat among senior leadership discussing issues that threatened the integrity of the hiring system itself. Rebecca crossed her arms. That still does not explain why she is here. Daniel looked toward the large windows for a moment. The sunlight had softened, bathing the room in warm gold. Perhaps that is because everyone is asking the wrong question. A board member raised an eyebrow. Daniel continued. The important question is not why Jasmine is here. He tapped the report resting on the table. The important question is why no one noticed these problems until she walked into the room. The statement landed heavily. Several directors lowered their eyes toward the reports. Nobody had an immediate answer. Jasmine remained silent. She could feel the tension moving through the room like an unseen current. Yet she also noticed something else. Reflection. For the first time, people were no longer defending the system. They were examining it. Daniel stood and slowly walked toward the windows. His reflection stretched across the glass alongside the skyline beyond. This company prides itself on innovation, he said. We invest in technology. We invest in growth. We invest in leadership. He turned back toward the table. But leadership means very little if talented people never receive a fair opportunity to reach the room where decisions are made. The silence that followed felt different from before. Not uncomfortable, thoughtful. One director nodded slowly. Another closed a laptop and listened more carefully. Even Rebecca seemed less certain than she had been at the beginning of the meeting. Daniel returned to his seat. Months ago, the board approved an independent review of our hiring culture. Several people looked surprised. The project had been confidential. The purpose was not to find blame. The purpose was to find truth. Jasmine finally spoke. Her voice remained calm and steady. Systems do not improve because people are perfect. They improve because people are willing to examine what others overlook. The room listened carefully. No one interrupted her. Sunlight reflected across the polished table, illuminating reports, notebooks, and glasses of water. For a brief moment, the boardroom felt unusually still. Then a notification appeared on the large screen behind Daniel. A confidential board document had just been uploaded. Several directors looked toward it. Rebecca frowned. Daniel glanced at the screen and slowly exhaled. It seems the final report has arrived. He looked toward Jasmine, then toward the board. And before we continue, there is something every person in this room deserves to understand. The room fell silent once again. Even the air seemed to pause, because whatever Daniel was about to reveal next would change the way everyone in the building viewed Jasmine Brooks forever. Jasmine could feel every eye in the boardroom fixed on her. The silence seemed to stretch across the 40-foot conference table and settle against the glass walls overlooking Chicago. Afternoon sunlight had faded into a softer golden glow, casting long reflections across polished wood and chrome. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Daniel Harrison remained standing beside the large presentation screen, his expression calm and unreadable. The confidential document remained open behind him. Rebecca Collins sat perfectly still. For the first time all day, she looked uncertain. Daniel glanced around the room before speaking. Many of you have spent the last hour asking why Jasmine is here. His voice carried easily through the silence. Some of you are probably wondering why her opinion has been taken so seriously. Several directors exchanged brief looks. No one denied it. Daniel nodded slightly. The answer is actually very simple. He stepped away from the screen and walked slowly around the conference table. The room followed him with their eyes. Sunlight reflected off the city skyline behind him. Jasmine remained seated, her hands folded quietly in front of her. Daniel stopped beside her chair. The silence deepened. Even the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed distant now. Rebecca looked from Daniel to Jasmine, clearly sensing that something significant was about to happen. Daniel looked down at Jasmine and smiled. It was not a corporate smile. Not the smile of a chief executive addressing a board. It was warmer, more personal. Then, without saying a word, he extended his hand toward her. The room froze. Jasmine looked up at him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then she placed her hand gently into his. Gasps quietly echoed around the conference table. One director blinked in disbelief. Another slowly lowered his glasses. Rebecca stared as if she could not process what she was seeing. Daniel helped Jasmine rise from her seat. Then he turned toward the room. There is something I should have shared months ago. His hand remained gently holding hers. Jasmine and I are engaged. Complete silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed capable of moving. The revelation swept through the room like a wave. Several board members looked back and forth between them. Others simply stared. Rebecca's face lost all color. The memory of the hiring meeting earlier that morning was suddenly impossible to ignore. The comments, the assumptions, the dismissive laughter. Every moment now looked completely different. Daniel allowed the silence to settle naturally. Then he continued. The reason none of you knew is because Jasmine requested privacy. He glanced toward her with obvious respect. She never wanted special treatment. She never wanted a title handed to her. She never wanted people to see her through my position. Several directors slowly nodded. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Jasmine had entered the company exactly the way any other applicant would. No advantages. No introductions. No protection. Rebecca lowered her eyes toward the table. Daniel continued. In fact, she insisted on experiencing the hiring process exactly as every other candidate experiences it. The statement landed harder than anything else he had said. The room understood immediately. Jasmine had not merely uncovered flaws in the system. She had lived through them. She had become evidence of them. The afternoon light shifted again as clouds moved across the skyline. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended what had happened. They could not. The truth was sitting in front of them. Then Daniel looked around the room one final time. "And now that everyone understands who Jasmine is," he said quietly, "there is one more thing you need to know." The room held its breath, because the revelation they had just witnessed was only the beginning. Jasmine felt the weight of the room settle around her as Daniel's final words faded into silence. His hand remained gently wrapped around hers, not as a display of power, not as a statement, simply as a reminder that she was not standing alone. Around the conference table, directors sat motionless. The revelation had changed everything. Yet Daniel's expression suggested there was still more to come. Outside the windows, the afternoon sky had begun turning amber. Sunlight painted long golden streaks across the city and reflected softly through the glass walls. Daniel slowly released Jasmine's hand and walked back toward the head of the table. The large screen behind him illuminated once again. A new document appeared. Several directors leaned forward. Rebecca Collins remained silent. Her eyes never left the screen. Daniel looked around the room. "When the board approved an independent review of our hiring culture 6 months ago, we knew numbers alone would never tell the full story." He paused briefly. "Data explains what is happening. Experience explains why." The room listened carefully. Jasmine understood exactly where he was going. Daniel continued, "That is why Jasmine agreed to participate in the review." Several directors exchanged surprised looks. One board member slowly nodded as understanding began to form. Daniel advanced the presentation. A timeline appeared. Hiring stages, review processes, candidate experiences, patterns hidden inside thousands of applications. "Over the last several months," he said, "Jasmine evaluated our hiring system from the perspective of a candidate, an analyst, and an independent observer." The room grew quiet once again. Rebecca stared at the screen. Every assumption she had made that morning now seemed painfully incomplete. Daniel turned toward Jasmine. "The findings presented today originated from her review." Several directors immediately looked at Jasmine with renewed respect. The woman they had dismissed as an applicant had actually been conducting one of the most important evaluations in company history. Yet Jasmine remained exactly as she had been all day, calm, composed, humble. She showed no sign of satisfaction, no desire to make anyone feel small. Daniel picked up a document from the table. "The board has already reviewed the recommendations." He looked toward the directors. One by one they nodded. Then he continued, "And earlier this week, the board unanimously approved the creation of a new Ethics and Fair Opportunity Council." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. Several executives sat forward. Daniel smiled slightly. "The purpose of the council is simple: to ensure that talent, character, and potential are never overshadowed by assumptions, appearances, or unconscious bias." The room listened in complete silence. Then Daniel looked directly at Jasmine. The board also selected its founding chair. The realization spread almost instantly. Rebecca's eyes widened. Several directors smiled. Others looked genuinely relieved. Daniel continued, "Jasmine Brooks has accepted that responsibility." For a moment nobody spoke. Then quiet applause began at one end of the table. Another director joined. Then another. Soon the boardroom filled with respectful applause. Not loud, not performative, genuine. Jasmine felt emotion rise inside her, but she kept her composure. She had never wanted recognition. She had wanted change. Across the table, Rebecca slowly lowered her eyes. The applause faded. Silence returned. Then something unexpected happened. Rebecca stood. Every head turned toward her. She looked at Jasmine for several long seconds. "I owe you an apology." Her voice was quiet but sincere. No one interrupted. Rebecca took a breath. "I believed I was evaluating people fairly." She glanced briefly toward the reports on the table. "Today I learned that confidence and fairness are not always the same thing." The room remained silent. Jasmine looked at her calmly. There was no anger in her expression, only understanding. Then she smiled gently. And in that moment, The atmosphere inside the boardroom changed completely. Jasmine's smile was small, but it carried more power than any speech she could have given. Rebecca stood quietly across the conference table, waiting for a response. The golden light pouring through the glass walls softened the entire room, turning the polished surfaces into reflections of amber and gold. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The board members watched carefully. They had witnessed the revelation, the data, the apology, and now they were witnessing something far rarer. Grace. Jasmine slowly stood from her chair. She looked at Rebecca, not with victory, but with understanding. "Thank you for saying that," she replied softly. The tension that had filled the boardroom all afternoon seemed to loosen all at once. Rebecca nodded, her eyes lowering briefly before she returned to her seat. No dramatic confrontation followed. No humiliation. No demand for punishment. The silence itself carried the lesson. Daniel watched the exchange from the head of the table. A quiet sense of pride crossed his face. Not because Jasmine had been proven right, because she had once again chosen character over power. The meeting continued for another hour. Recommendations were approved. New oversight procedures were adopted. Hiring policies were revised. Directors volunteered to participate in the implementation process. What had started as an uncomfortable review became the beginning of a cultural change. Yet the most important moment had already happened. As evening approached, the city beyond the windows slowly transformed. Office lights flickered on across the skyline. Streets below filled with streams of headlights. The blue sky deepened toward twilight. One by one, directors gathered their folders and left the room. Several paused to shake Jasmine's hand. Others thanked her for her honesty. A few admitted they had never considered how differently the hiring process might look from the perspective of an applicant. Their words were sincere, not because they felt obligated, because they had learned something. Eventually, only a handful of people remained. Rebecca was among the last to leave. As she approached the door, she stopped beside Jasmine. "I hope we can work together on this," she said quietly. Jasmine smiled. "That is the goal." Rebecca nodded. Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. The boardroom finally grew still. Outside, the city glowed beneath the first lights of evening. Daniel walked over and stood beside Jasmine near the glass wall overlooking Chicago. Neither of them spoke at first. They simply looked out across the skyline. The reflection of the city shimmered in the windows around them. Thousands of lights stretched to the horizon. Somewhere below, people were finishing work, heading home, beginning evenings they would remember or forget. Life continued. Daniel slipped his hand gently into hers. "Quite a day," he said. Jasmine laughed softly. "That is one way to describe it." The sound echoed quietly through the nearly empty boardroom. For a moment they stood together in comfortable silence. The same building that had greeted Jasmine with assumptions that morning now felt completely different. Not because her relationship had been revealed. Not because she had received a leadership role. Because the truth had been allowed to speak. Daniel looked toward her. "Do you regret doing it this way?" Jasmine thought about the interview, the comments, the uncomfortable silence, the data, the apology. Then she slowly shook her head. No, her answer came without hesitation. Beyond the glass, the final traces of sunlight disappeared behind the skyline. The city lights grew brighter. The boardroom grew quieter. And as night settled across Chicago, one truth remained. Titles can open doors. Power can command attention. But character is what changes people. And long after the meeting ended, long after the reports were filed away, that was the lesson everyone would remember.